Well, I worked with Joseph Madhimba from 1980 up to about, you know, the 1990s, because I'd moved from the former African Service, which is now called Radio Zimbabwe. It was also called Radio 2, to the news department, where we were now introducing news in Shona and Ndebele, as well as English on the early segment, which was only in English before. We called the news Naudze Kutanga, Indaba Zakuqala, early news. So Joseph was on the television news desk just like me, except that he was on the English news desk. But starting off with the radio news, because he started reading news on radio and then was introduced to television. Joseph was a very polished presenter, and you'll recall that time is a time when there were a lot of criticisms about black people or Africans reading news in English, because during colonial Rhodesia, English programs and the English service were run by white people. So at independence, to hear someone speaking in English, reading news in English on Radio 1 and on television, there were some criticisms that came from different quarters, especially among the white community. But as for Joseph, because he was a polished newsreader, he was well liked across the board, and someone was also able to train other broadcasters to polish up their act in terms of delivery of news, such that you'd really enjoy the news when Joseph was reading news on radio as well as on television. He also used to present a program called Newsbeat together with the likes of Dorcas Chibanda, who also read TV news, and Naison Nekaneganje, who was also on the radio news desk, and Joseph Masuku. So they presented a Newsbeat, and Joseph, in addition to that, presented on television with colleagues like Wellington Bufana, Eunice Pende, Temba Hove, Busi Chindove, Noreen Welsh, and many others. Some were from the news department. There were sub-editors, presenters like I was on the vernacular news desk, like he was on the English news desk. Some were also coming from outside. There were good news readers who were working out and coming as freelancers to present news at 8 o'clock. But those mainly who were coming from the news department would be sub-editors. So the advantage that Joseph had was he really wanted his copy, to be well written, because he was also a writer. So before you read news, you had to gabble the news to make sure that all the corrections are taken care of, so that you can be polished when you come out on radio, TV. So with Joseph, he would make sure that his copy is well polished, and he would add some of the things that the reporters and the sub-editors would not have added to nourish that story that he would then be reading on air. And resultantly, he really coached a lot of people in news reading, and also especially pronunciation, because people would struggle with pronouncing certain names and certain words. And Joseph was particularly interested in French words. Each time there was a French word, it was a party for Joseph, because he would then be explaining the origins of that word and how it should be pronounced and what it means. What I also remember about Joseph, because you see, the newsroom was just a small place. Our door was there. Joseph was right inside the bigger newsroom. I know it has changed now. So we really were together most of the time. So what was very interesting was that whenever there were some of these foreign names, like the Farabundo Maruti National Liberation Front, he really would enjoy. You could tell even on the screen or on radio that Joseph enjoyed some of these words, especially when he was pronouncing them during news bulletins. So the other thing about Joseph, well, he was a friendly guy, quiet, on the quiet side, but with me, we're very, very friendly. We called each other Ja. I don't know whether it's French. He didn't say Johnny. He would say, Ja, how are you? Yeah, I saw you over the weekend and so forth. So the other thing, he liked reading, he liked studying, and interestingly, he liked business courses. I know he read business, he read English, and even in Namibia, where he ended up working, I'm told that he was at a polytechnic and teaching business courses. I visited Namibia on some occasions. Unfortunately, I was not able to meet with Joseph because he was out of the city. But I would have loved to see how he lived in Namibia. We tried the other day with Farai Mnyuki, who used to be the editor of the Herald and also relocated to Namibia, to look around for him, but were not successful in getting him. But those other colleagues who went to Namibia were able to do that. It's sad to have lost a person like Madhimba, and again, he had been out of our minds for quite some time because he then lived in Namibia. But he was never forgotten. People have always been talking about him, reposting his news reading stints that he had way back. Even the sets you can see, those were some of the old sets, including some of the colleagues that he read news with. All those reminded us. Each time they are posted, it reminded us of this polished broadcaster who really loved good diction, good pace in news reading, who also trained quite a number of broadcasters over the years until he left the ZBC. So you'll always be remembered, and you will be remembered as a colleague on radio, on television, and as a friend. I know he was also a devout Catholic, if I'm not mistaken, because he also will talk about church issues in between the news bulletins. When you're in the newsroom, there are a number of things that you talk about over and above the stories that you'll be writing.